Our latest courageous conversation here at Color 10 is called We the People. It's based on the notion that we as Americans have a lot in common.
But David, you wouldn't think so with today's political scene. Polls indicate that both voters and politicians haven't been this divided since perhaps our Civil War.
So we want to know, Brian, how we got here, how bad things really are, and what we the people can do to find some common ground.
Now, the answer won't be easy or fast. People hold to what they believe reality to be, and folks aren't usually keen to change their minds, even when presented with convincing evidence.
And that's why we're here not to change your mind. Instead, we're going to provide you some points of view to consider about political issues facing our community, our state, and our nation.
Along the way, we'll hear from local and national experts on topics ranging from political parties to media, religion, and more. We hope you'll consider other sides of the issues presented and decide anew whether there's more to an issue than meets the eye.
Yeah, our goal is simply to start a conversation about our nation's differences, not to change how you think about your politics, but to give you some perspective on the things that both divide and unite us.
So, David, we start with one of the most common themes in modern American politics, the red and blue colors. By now, you've seen those political maps of the U.S. with states shaded in red and blue. Since 1984, the television networks have designated blue to mean Democratic states and red to stand for Republican states. In reality, though, the most dominant color on this map isn't one you see on election night: purple.
This county-level electoral map produced by the website Politico shows the solid reds and blues are in isolated pockets of the country. Sprinkled across the nation are shades of purple, representing counties whose vote percentage for the president was generally between 40 and 60%. One way to interpret this is that Americans don't conform to the characterization of a polarized people, but instead the people only appear polarized because they get just two real choices in any given election that have a shot of winning. This is also a chicken and egg question. Are the parties and candidates polarized to appeal to people, or do the people demand polarization? Dr. Melissa Michelson is an expert on political polarization and teaches political science at Menlo College in California.
Right? And so we've become kind of more tribal. We've got politicians encouraging people to really identify with one political party and really feel like it's us versus them.
If Michelson is correct, it means that we are as responsible for the state of modern politics as the politicians we blame for polarization. But it's also true that perspectives drive behavior. We are capable of coming together as a people, but we quickly fall back to our differences. The national tragedy in Las Vegas being just the most recent example. Our nation grieved for the loss of life and then became polarized again when the grieving was politicized around gun control.
There are clear differences across our nation, but there's a lot more commonality than we the people often appreciate. The role today's media plays in covering politics is both tough and controversial, as David reports.
Started in radio when I was 16.
Mike Peters will be a familiar face to longtime Color 10 viewers. He was our station's main evening news anchor from 1979 to 1990, a time when America wasn't quite as polarized and people had a different view of what they saw and took away from the nightly news.
When I came to work here in '79, they still had their first generation of video cameras. And so that was a huge change in how things operated. How we cover news today is different because of the 24-hour news cycle. And I think the temperament of politicians is different today than it used to be. You can see in our current situation in Washington, D.C. with the advent of Facebook and Twitter, there's a tendency and the ability to bypass the news media and to go directly to your constituency to put forth your ideas in 140 characters.
So how did we become so polarized in America? How has the news media played a role? History shows something called the Fairness Doctrine, introduced in 1949, aimed to ensure equal treatment of opposing points of view. But that doctrine was repealed in 1987 because some felt it limited the rights of the press. Then came the advent of talk radio in the 1970s, and cable news outlets like CNN, MSNBC, and Fox News years later. Most cable news outlets have transitioned now, offering half news and half commentary programming. The problem for Americans is trying to decipher the difference between the two. Dan Shelley, Executive Director of the Radio Television Digital News Association.
I think many of those, not all, but many of those involved in the opinion media have helped inflame this polarization that we're seeing today and this increased level of vitriol targeting reporters, targeting political opponents, etc. Responsible journalists who actually seek and report the facts, or as what Carl Bernstein calls the most obtainable version of the truth possible, I honestly don't believe they have any culpability, we have any culpability in the polarization we're seeing today.
Many say the popularity of social media and internet sites has also fed America's political polarization. The public can seek out information from partisan sources with which they agree, bypassing factually based reporting. It's a trend not lost on those who defend the rights of reporters or members of Congress.
Certainly the media, unlike the media 25 or 30 years ago, you can easily go to have your own view of what you want to hear reinforced, as opposed to go to one place where you could get a fair set of facts. On any given day, just look back at the news 10 days earlier. And I think in America today, you'd be shocked that that could have only been 10 days ago when you think about and how big a thing that seemed like at the moment. When today it's like that problem wasn't a problem at all. I think that's part of the problem.
News consumers now find it difficult because there are so many sources of information vying for their attention to determine what the truth is. The other effect I think it's had is positive in that there are so many sources of information available literally at people's fingertips now. It gives them a much greater opportunity than they ever had before to check the veracity of the information they're receiving from certain news sources.
Shelley says while national studies and research projects show support for the media is tepid, he says people tend to support local journalism and believe and trust local journalism more than they do national journalism. If America has any hope with regard to the news information that often fans the flames of its polarization, most seem to agree that citizens bear part of the responsibility.
You know, I think the one thing we can't lose sight of is the very important role that journalism plays. We can never lose sight of the fact, and there are some people that say that, you know, it's fake news, it doesn't hold a place in society, but it's good reporting that keeps the people in power honest.
But I think citizens in general have a responsibility, and that is to seek the truth on their own, to check the veracity of the information that they're receiving, to make an effort to find news and information other than simply from sources with which they tend to share a point of view.
You know, faith is an Ozarks cornerstone, and as our common lingo shows us, it has a profound impact on how people think about political matters.
I can't tell you how many times I've been told that Christians shouldn't have nothing to do with politics, and of course that's ridiculous.
Alvin Morrow supposes it was back in 2008 when he first felt the need to get more involved.
Barack Obama was running for president during the campaign. I heard him quote Karl Marx, and I looked at my wife and I says, we're in trouble.
Today, Morrow is the founder and executive director of Christians Uniting for Political Action.
The type of laws and a type of society that brings the best effect, if you would, or the best result is a Christian society.
Perhaps that same spirit moving Morrow today is the same that moved Billy Graham to publicly endorse presidential candidates in the 1960s.
With the Congress now reconvening and the election heating up.
Or maybe it's the spirit behind Jerry Falwell and the moral majority of the 1980s.
And I think he is on the side of the angels.
Actually, Jerry Falwell is the father of this current movement, if you would, with the moral majority. He basically was telling the church to, you know, hey, let's get off the pews.
And while those movements are a glimpse into what it looked like to mix religion with politics in the past, today that mixture looks a little more like debates on abortion rights or same-sex marriage, in which people often choose a side based on their faith.
Creating a cake celebrating gay marriage violates his religious beliefs.
American citizens should not be compelled to create expression or to say things that they that are deeply at odds with their beliefs.
We don't seek the division for its own sake, but it's the truth that's divisive.
Nicholas Lund-Molfisi with the Springfield Cape Girardeau Catholic Diocese explains religion points people to what they consider to be the truth.
Catholics engage public life with certain values. We try to explain the truth of those values, and we think we can do it in a way that's comprehensible to everyone, believers and non-believers.
And that truth directs people's political stance.
The truth that all are created equal divides the country in the Civil War.
He says the conflict stems from resisting that truth.
I mean, I wouldn't want to say, well, religion divided us or the truth divided us. People reacted against that truth. So the abortion debate, maybe that's to be concrete, because I'm sure that's more helpful. Children have a right to be protected in law and embraced in life. These are deep, controversial truths. And of course, many children are denied those rights.
And quite honestly, people are the problem.
But Professor Rob Bartels with Evangel University says more often it can be the other way around.
It doesn't really matter what they belong to. They always have different ideas and they'll defend them to the hilt.
Bartels says Scripture is frequently used to reinforce a predetermined stance.
They look at the circumstances they're in and they find support for it in the Scriptures. Both sides do. And once you find that support, you stand firm upon that foundation and you argue your points.
Unfortunately, we're playing defense.
And while many, like Morrow, say their faith is a shield,
you're talking about changing society as we know it. We're being more, if you would, evangelized by the culture than we are evangelizing the culture.
To anyone who disagrees, that shield might look like a sword.
We are all, every one of us, made by the same God in heaven.
Do you think any kind of political progress made through Christian influence infringes on the rights of those who aren't Christian?
That infringe on the rights?
Does it infringe on the rights of those who aren't Christian?
No, I don't think so. I think what we're dealing with for the most part, with the exception of the redefining of marriage and the redefining of gender, I think until then, I don't think there was any specific legislation that we influenced that infringed on anyone's rights.
David, current political events give us cause to ask, have we been here before? Our Heather Lewis dives into the history of our nation's political divides.
Locally, we have a place in the history books.
Back in those days, you had families split, whether they fought on the North or South, and their obligations and their ideas were basically split families.
Slavery had created a crater in our country since its revolution.
That's the most brutal part of our history, I think, in the United States, was the Civil War.
From 1861 to 1865, nearly 1 million armed men formed battle lines from Virginia to Missouri. 620,000 soldiers would lose their lives.
The second major battle of the Civil War was fought just outside of Springfield here in Republic, Missouri at Wilson's Creek National Battlefield. Eventually, the North would win, upholding equal liberty for all Americans.
But after the Civil War, racism ensued. Downtown Springfield, 1906, 3 black men were lynched by a mob in Park Central Square. A plaque now recognizes the hurtful history, from race to religion.
I get my inspiration from the sky.
Fast forward to the 1930s, Gerald L.K. Smith, known for his power speaking at the pulpit, the so-called minister of hate, was also a far-right politician.
I believe that the criticism is an honor to my lifetime career.
He, along with Senator Huey Long and radio priest Charles Coughlin, developed the Share Our Wealth Society. Smith also formed the America First political party, which he ran for president as an isolationist in 1944. Although controversial, Gerald L.K. Smith established a place for Christ in the Ozarks that thousands of people still visit today. He founded the Passion Play in Eureka Springs, Arkansas, and created the Christ of the Ozarks. He and his wife are buried at the foot of it. Having a different political stance also created a major divide during the Vietnam War. More than 58,000 Americans were killed in a war many thought the U.S. should not be fighting. One anti-war protest turned deadly in Ohio when the National Guard killed 4 unarmed college students at Kent State University. 9 others were injured. That event further strengthened student protests against the war on college campuses around the nation.
Party conflict is part of our political DNA, and our Joe Marano gives us a side-by-side comparison of the two sides.
All the way back in 1797, in his farewell address to the nation after his presidency, George Washington warned that political parties should not be the system that determines who runs the country. However, political parties have been part of our political landscape ever since. So while we are at the current juncture in the political spectrum, what are the differences between the two? Both parties have several messages with a differing core value. Skylar Johnston of Greene County Democrats says that liberals believe if everyone can benefit, why shouldn't government take action to make that possible?
A rising tide raises all boats, and that we all do better when we all do better.
While conservatives tend to think slightly differently, as described by Eric Burleson.
Your rights, your freedoms, and who you are, your purpose, your liberty, and whatever it is that your purpose in life is given to you by your Creator, by your God. And that government's role is really limited.
The viewpoint of how those in Washington are involved varies greatly. Liberals would prefer more involvement when it comes to helping the American people, while conservatives operate off of a different belief.
Government oversight is always going to be a good idea. Yeah, absolutely.
Government's role, if anything, is to A, get out of the way, and B, come alongside individuals and encourage them to be involved in charities.
Individualism has grown to be key in a conservative's mindset.
The highest goal is to allow individuals to do what is in their best interest and to make certain that there's no government entity taking away your authority to pursue the life, the dreams, the aspirations that you as an individual have.
The primary thought being, if you can make your own success, find a way to do so and reap the rewards of it. But that's not to say that those less fortunate should be forgotten about. The conservative line of thought is looking after one another is what makes the country great.
The time in American history where we are known as being great is the time when people looked to their neighbors instead of looking to government.
Compare that to a liberal mindset, which would look to the likes of former Minnesota Senator Paul Wellstone.
Any kind of unchecked power is going to lead to really damaging effects.
If government steps in to regulate costs to help some with basic cost of living, that's viewed as a step in the right direction.
Our biggest concerns are jobs. They're rebuilding the economy, rebuilding the middle class, making sure that everybody has access to affordable health care. A broken arm shouldn't ruin somebody's life, and there's a lot of instances where a car wreck can put somebody in bankruptcy.
As we move forward as a nation, it doesn't appear that President Washington's advice will be heeded. Both parties are going to carry on their own ways to make the United States better.
Republicans and Democrats want the same things. It's just we differ greatly on how that happens. We don't feel that our success has to come at the expense of someone else, that we can all benefit from American society.
David, even our sports have become political, as Dan Lucy now has some insight on how American sports have been used for political statements over the years.
Colin Kaepernick's protest has grown from one player to hundreds, kneeling, locking arms, or sitting during anthems. It's resonated with some fans and infuriated others, and got the attention of the National Football League.
We respect our country, respect our flag, we respect our national anthem. We all feel very strongly about our country and our pride, and we're going to continue to do that.
One thing's for sure, Colin Kaepernick is using one of the oldest plays at a sports game plan, the political protest. And if you think this is something new, you haven't been paying attention.
Jesse Owens in 1936 in the Berlin Olympics to 1947. Jackie Robinson broke the color line in professional baseball. 1967, Muhammad Ali refused to report for military duty. 1968, Tommy Smith and John Carlos in the Mexico City Olympics. 2016, you remember the St. Louis Rams coming out of the tunnel with the hands up, don't shoot.
Professor Pam Sailors is the Associate Dean of Humanities at Missouri State University and teaches a sports sociology course.
I think one of the great things about sport is that it can be this escape from all of the troubles of the world. And so I think that's part of why I go, oh no, don't bring that in here. This is the place we get away from that.
But bringing political discourse onto the field is exactly what these athletes want to do, and they have a constitutional right to have their voice heard.
I think it's necessary.
I think it's a way to bring light to an issue that if you do it another way, I don't think it gets that same attention.
Brad Smith quarterbacked the Mizzou Tigers in the early 2000s and played 9 years in the NFL with the Jets and the Bills.
Part of the inequity is telling somebody how they should bring light to an injustice. I think it's one of the most patriotic things you can do, to really care about other people, white and black, who are receiving injustices. So it's necessary.
Smith has spent half of his lifetime in football locker rooms, a place where black and white players from different socioeconomic backgrounds become one unit.
Hopefully this country can look at it in the face just like we do in those NFL locker rooms and deal with it and come closer together. That's what it's all about.
Smith says he understands where players like Kaepernick come from.
Even playing in the NFL, graduating from college, and the first thing people see is your skin color. They cross the street, or they lock their doors, or they shun you, and then they hear you play football, then the whole attitude changes. So it's still going on. It is, I believe, getting better, and I think the more we talk about it, the better it's going to get.
I think that discussing things is healthy for our society. I think that yelling at one another is probably not.
One reason for the level of anger could be a misperception of how the NFL players are protesting. They're either sitting or kneeling during the national anthem, when the flag and the soldiers who died defending it are being saluted.
But that's the essence of a symbol, is that you don't own it. And you don't get to, symbols are tricky, right? Think about the Confederate flag. Do you get to say, no, this is what this means? Or has it already become something that's beyond your control?
Another thing that's out of control is social media. Between Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook, any protest is immediately flashed around the world.
A protest can become very big very quickly, just because it's so easy to retweet or to like or to share.
And so can reaction to a protest. For more than 100 years, sport has wrapped itself in the flag, especially the NFL. And for just as long, athletes have used that stage to protest. After all, it's part of the game.
While we might want to say, stick to sport, keep your politics out of here, politics are already there. But what we're noticing is somebody who has a dissenting opinion.
I'm excited because it has to happen. There has to be a point where you look at it in the face and you deal with it. Nothing ever gets fixed by avoiding it or not being uncomfortable.
As a result of the protests, the NFL and its players have opened a dialogue on social issues.
Brian, social media certainly brings us closer, both friend and foe, as our Daniel Shedd explains.
Think back, if you will, to 2005. The internet, out of its infancy, seemingly transformed overnight by Tom Anderson. Perhaps you remember that name. He was your first friend upon logging in to MySpace, which officially overtook the web as the #1 visited site in America that year. Yes, even over Google. Thankfully, those top 8 friendships are still intact. Or are they? Because firestorms on platforms like Facebook, Twitter, Snapchat, and Instagram are still very much more than a virtual reality.
Everybody's so quick to look at social media as, it's this new form of communication, but we are actually using it in the way that traditionally we've always communicated.
Whether you're one of President Trump's more than 42 million followers on Twitter or a part of Hillary Clinton's more than 9 million friends on Facebook, one thing is certain, according to Drury Communications Department Chair Jonathan Groves.
There's always been polarization in politics.
Conflict.
What is different now, what social media has enabled us to do that is probably a little more dangerous, is to go off into our ideological corners.
In years past, media outlets, although varied, were limited. We don't have that problem in 2017.
We can encounter more information in a week on the internet than people before they had a lot of books might encounter in a year or even a lifetime.
In fact, clinical psychologists like Adam Andreasen study the science behind why we feel threatened with differing viewpoints.
For most of history, we've always had a village. We've always had a group of, 300 to 500 of your closest friends all there together to gossip and backbite, but also to protect ourselves. And one of the big challenges with online media is AI, artificial intelligence.
Facebook outlines their algorithm on its website. The stories that show in your news feed are influenced by your connections and activity. This helps you to see more stories that interest you from friends you interact with the most. In layman's terms, the more you click on certain stories, the more that platform spoon feeds you that information.
Which means there's fewer and fewer opportunities to encounter people that are different than you, ideas that are different than you, starts narrowing the field of stuff that you might encounter on a day-to-day basis. So then think what happens when my friend has a different political perspective than I do. I suddenly am faced with this attribution bias that, well, their character must be flawed if they have a different perspective than mine, and they might be dangerous to me. Because if different ideas are dangerous, different ideas could mean other people, and other people are outsiders.
It's exhausting. And so the best way to deal with it, you just unplug and you just say, I don't even want to think about any of that, because it just makes me mad, right? Whatever side you're on, it's just like people yelling at each other, and we turn on the TV and everybody's yelling at each other, and it's like, that's not how we want it. Most people don't want to live their lives that way. I've been sort of on a mission, or crusade, I should say, of trying to get people to become more conscientious media consumers and media creators, so that when you're going out there, you have to have a sense of honesty and authenticity about what you're doing, and you ought to have a view of skepticism that you're approaching of what's out there. You don't want your skepticism to devolve into cynicism, where you don't believe anything that you see online.
Well, let's be honest. Most of us are not going to choose to break out of our social media villages. We like our friends, we like our families, and yes, we all like scrolling to the top of the page and seeing a story that confirms our belief system. But this series is called We the People. Don't you think it's time that we begin to act with some civility towards outsiders? Who knows? Maybe that little civility will prove that we have a little bit more in common than a profile could ever show. Religion is an inspiration, but can it be a remedy for our political rancor? Our Colin Lingo shares perspective.
The signs you see on the side of the road, they say United.
Faith is a complicated phenomenon to talk about.
But Nicholas Lund Malfisi, with the Springfield Cape Girardeau Catholic Diocese, and the rest of us for that matter, know that faith can push all of us in a few different political directions.
There's Christian traditions that live apart from the world, that don't vote, and that don't engage in civic life. On the other end of the spectrum, there are other religious communities that are so politically involved and so active, you might joke that they're one of our political parties at prayer.
You know, a man does what he believes.
Calvin Morrow, with Christians Uniting for Political Action, knows it was his faith that led him to his position on the political spectrum.
A real Christian, in my opinion, is extremely to the right if you want to use political terms.
That not everybody thinks the same.
And Barbara Block, a rabbi in Springfield, says faiths outside of Christianity steer people's politics as well.
My tradition, which is the Reformed Jewish tradition, tends to lean liberal, but it does not mean that all Reformed Jews lean liberal.
But you know, saying our religion plays a role in our politics, that's kind of a safe statement. It's harder, however, to look at how our religion influences our politics. What are some of the current issues being weighed in on by the religious?
Holy Mary, Mother of God.
Well, how about abortion rights?
So generally you'll find the Catholic rhetoric relies on what we call the natural law, the truths that are part of our nature. So this truth I mentioned before about that every child has a right to a mother and father, that children have a right to be protected in law and embraced in life. These are deep, controversial truths.
Not the church, not the state. Women must decide their fate.
How about gay marriage?
It's always been understood as a traditional marriage between a man and a woman. And so you're talking about changing society as we know it.
Okay, another tough question. Why do people mix their faith with their politics at all? Okay.
As a Christian, you have a responsibility to participate.
Over that, we spoke with Professor Rob Bartels at Evangel University.
And so by doing so, you're protecting the freedoms that are given to you, the liberties that are provided to you through the Constitution. And so it is kind of showcasing the responsibility that Christians have. Well, if that's the case, then I need to be in the marketplace. I need to be out there sharing ideas that are based upon our worldview or our fundamentalist ideas. and share them out there and in some ways promote it, maybe even protect it if necessary.
Now the final question, and possibly the hardest one to answer. Does it help or hurt the divisiveness in our country when we mix our religion with our politics? Well, that's up to you to decide, but there are two ways you can look at it. On one hand, yes, our faith does give us the tools to make this world a better place. But on the other hand, it also makes disagreeing a little more personal. When you disagree with my politics, perhaps you're also disagreeing with the faith I based that position on. And in that way and through that angle, it sort of seems like faith is the gasoline thrown on an already heated political climate.
No issue is more divisive in America, it seems, than race. And Jennifer Abreu walks us through a look at our nation's racial challenges.
An image of America in 2017. Go home! Divided by race. For some, it's like history has been forgotten, and the nation hasn't learned from its past.
Unfortunately, the political divide in this nation has created, I would say almost regurgitated, the issues of our racial differences.
Wes Pratt is assistant to the president and chief diversity officer at Missouri State University. He says race is something the country hasn't dealt with adequately.
We've got unfinished business when it comes to addressing the issues of race.
According to a 2017 Pew Research Center survey, the number of Americans who say racism is a big problem is the highest it has been in more than 10 years. That number has about doubled since 2011, from 28 to 58%. The study says 81% of blacks say racism is a big problem, compared with about 52% of whites. A 2016 survey shows most Americans believe individual racism is a bigger problem than institutional racism. Pratt believes the opposite.
Institutional racism has caused the racial divide.
And says it's an issue deeply rooted in the country's history.
And there were laws that were made to justify slavery. You had to legislate to get black people the right to vote, the right to not to be discriminated against.
An unsolved issue that rises back to the surface in different ways. One example is police-community relations.
The police has been used to enforce and reinforce the laws that were made that were racist in nature.
Movements like Black Lives Matter have brought some attention and started conversations surrounding some of the struggles of black communities. However, race in America isn't only a black and white issue.
And they've become very, very much more active in articulating those things, whereas Latinos, we tend to be more passive.
Latinos are the second fastest growing group in the U.S. after Asians. Yet many stereotypes still exist.
Everybody thinks, oh, well, you're Mexican. There's actually 22 countries where people from Latino origin come from.
Juan Meraz, Assistant Vice President for Diversity and Inclusion at MSU, says moving to the Ozarks from New Mexico back in the 80s was a bit of a culture shock.
I went to a grocery store and a gentleman came up and he asked me, what breed are you? And I was like, what do you mean?
He says back then there were only 4 Latinos on campus. Today, 780 students and staff members register as Latino. According to the 2010 census in Greene County, the Latino population is 3.6%, which is a little over 10,000.
I've never seen 10,000, but they're out there.
However, Latinos can be of any race.
So we have a lot of diversity in our own Latino population, and part of it is also educating our own people.
The African American population in Greene County is 3.3%.
To me, there's more diversity than there was when I was a kid growing up here, when I was in the public school system.
In Springfield today, about 25% of the student population in the public school district is racially diverse. Now, that might not sound like a large number, but for those who were here years ago, the city has come a long way.
When I used to walk down the street and be called names and the N-word and things like that, unfortunately, a lot of that still happens. But as a young man who grew up here, I can see the difference.
Both Pratt and Meraz are watching Springfield's population slowly become more diverse.
Despite what's going on nationally, despite anti-immigrant sentiment, despite Charlottesville, despite Ferguson, we are going to work to improve our community. And that, to me, is what's exciting about Springfield.
And people tend to say, well, we're different, this and this and this, but look at all the similarities. And that really builds a lot of bridges.
A good place to start is opening up to a courageous conversation.
And the right tone. How do you pose that question? They say, oh, you have a beautiful accent. Where are you from? As opposed to saying, what breed are you?
knowing that sometimes having a good conversation doesn't involve speaking.
We have to engage and have to be willing to sit down and listen. You got to be able to listen. And most folks don't listen.
Because changing how we deal with racial issues as a country will start with our actions with those around us.
This situation now, people say, well, this is not America. Yes, it is. Yes, it is. And the question becomes, what are you now going to do about it?
Well, David, political divides have even entered the classroom, and our Bria Douglas shares her findings of how education is a new front line in the political battle.
Kids get one shot at a pre-K through 12th grade education. Some might even say it's the foundation of their future success. So there's no question, the federal government needs to get it right. However, how that's best accomplished can be controversial, as schools wait in limbo for it to get sorted out.
Public education has become a political football.
If we're comparing it to the sport, the football Nixa School Superintendent Dr. Stephen Kleinsmith says is your child's education, with the stadium located at the United States Capitol, and the players are members of Congress, serving as both Democrats and Republicans with a handful of independents.
I think both parties have very clearly established their willingness to not work together very well. I wonder if the quality of the idea is even important to them. I think what happens is if it has political gain made available for their party, they run that up the flagpole. Kids end up suffering because of it.
One example of this, according to educators I talked to, was the No Child Left Behind Act, introduced under the Bush administration in 2001, a law that has since been replaced, but was partially designed to measure students' academic progress based on standardized tests, something that Dr. Kleinsmith says can be harmful when students are only learning to pass an exam.
The problem is with some state or federal mandates is it gets you to focus maybe too much on just a test item or a set of questions on a test. And you start, as they say, teaching to the test.
I think they suffer in that a lot of the things that they are asked to do are not based on research.
By people with experience in the field of education, according to Susan Hanchey, a kindergarten teacher at John Thomas School of Discovery.
It gets very frustrating when the experts in the field are not consulted about what needs to happen. Aaron Sachs and Associates don't come to me for legal advice. That's not my area of expertise, that's their area of expertise.
Ultimately, it's educators who want a place on the coaching team to decide the best play moving forward for education policy.
It just seems common sense.
It's a situation that ties the hands of public schools when accepting federal grants. After all, it's those funds that usually come with strings attached.
That came from Grove City versus Bell, U.S. Supreme Court case, where the Supreme Court said if you take any federal money, you are susceptible to submitting to any kind of federal regulation.
Sometimes I question whether or not we need any of their assistance as we go about the business of educating the youth of our community and throughout the state and nation. But having said that, they do contribute about 6% of our budget comes from the federal government.
As a result, some of the power is taken away from individual schools on what is taught and placed in the government's control.
Even if your private schools took Department of Agriculture money for milk, the state has the right to say, well, then you have to take our state assessments because you took federal dollars.
Although experts have offered differing opinions on what's wrong with government interference in the school system, here's what Springfield School Superintendent Dr. John Jungman says has worked, and that's the Every Student Succeeds Act, also known as ESSA.
One of the best things that's happened most recently with federal expectation is ESSA, which is the replacement for No Child Left Behind. So I think we learned some things of what's bad about No Child Left Behind. There were some good things, but there were some things that weren't great. And ESSA, which was passed in 2015, had huge bipartisan support from both sides of the aisle. And it really had as an intent of returning more local control to states and to communities to serve students.
So, the issue to consider is whether a child's education should be a political football, left in the hands of the winning political party or in the hands of local educators.
From education to the environment, now even the great outdoors seem to be part of the political divide. Jesse Inman reports.
Oftentimes, conservation and environmentalism are perceived as different ideals.
Environmentalism is definitely more of a liberal thought, a liberal concept than conservationism.
I would say conservation is probably more conservative, and then environmentalism is probably more liberal.
Well, conservationism, in my opinion, is going to be more conservative. Environmentalism is more of a liberal practice.
Now, before I set out to leave no stone unturned, I surely expected a stark contrast between the two groups. For instance, maybe you think of a conservationist as a conservative, good old country folk who wants nothing to do but hunt and fish. Maybe your view of a hardcore environmentalist is someone who's a liberal, obsessed with going green with everything. Well, if you think like that, I hate to break it to you, but environmentalist and conservationist, not so different.
Francis Skaliski is a member of the Missouri Department of Conservation.
Conservation is about the protection, preservation, and restoration of habitats, species.
Jennifer Connor is a member of the Sierra Club, an environmentalist group.
With the Sierra Club, we definitely believe in preserving and protecting our natural world.
Both have very similar goals, ensuring the quality and safety of nature and the wildlife that inhabits it.
If we want to conserve wildlife, as our Department of Conservation does so well in the state of Missouri, then we have to make sure that we have clean air, clean water, and a clean landscape for them to thrive.
There needs to be good habitat, clean water. If you get humans involved in the stewardship of the resources, they develop an appreciation for those resources. With hunting, human involvement, it gets people out in the woods, out on the landscape. And when they're out there, they realize why our outdoors are so neat, why our habitats are so important.
Did he say hunting? That can't be part of the environmentalists' ideas, can it?
For me personally, my husband hunts, and we just had deer chili last week. So I think personally the Missouri Department of Conservation does a fine job of regulating hunting.
Now, this doesn't mean that everyone in the Sierra Club feels the same way about hunting.
We have people who are vegetarians and people who don't necessarily believe in hunting, and I think that's okay. So I think that inherently having different viewpoints really makes us a much richer society.
While conservationists and environmentalists won't agree on everything, it doesn't mean they can't work together. They even collaborated to help save the once endangered bald eagle.
I mean, after World War II, DDT was used pretty willy-nilly, and it affected the water, it affected the fish. The eagles ate the fish. Babies were not allowed to develop, and so they were pushed to the brink of extinction. Regulations were put in place to stop using DDT, and the eagles came back. And that is the power that we have over nature. That is a prime example of conservation and environmentalism together.
In my opinion, it's not like conservation and environmentalism are 180 degrees apart and they're completely butting heads.
These groups may not be as different as you think. They both want to keep things intact that people enjoy about the natural world.
I love hiking and camping.
I like hiking.
Honestly, some of the best memories I have are like around like a campfire setting.
For many years, enjoyed backpacking. I enjoy fishing. Pretty much being out with the family, out at the parks and stuff. That's kind of what we do.
It doesn't matter why you enjoy the outdoors. Your reason may be different than your neighbors. But what does matter is that we, the people, respect each other's differences and find those values that we have in common. After all, there's enough beauty to go around here in the Ozarks, as long as we all work together and take care of it together.
Now, David, comes the chance to think through some ways the public can push back on polarization.
These are mere suggestions, simply food for thought, if you will, Brian, and certainly not an exhaustive list.
The first is to demand an end to partisan control over drawing House district boundaries. These district boundaries are reconfigured after every census. Now, the worst examples of party-drawn boundary lines have a name: gerrymandered. And these districts create incentives for politicians to appeal to a homogenous base of voters with little motive to seek compromise. We, the people, should call for an end to these party-drawn boundaries and instead have them replaced with nonpartisan commissions in every state.
Brian, the second is to simply remember that not all media outlets are created equal. Though you may like a particular source of information and agree with it much of the time, no single source is infallible. More importantly, several forms of media, including cable news and talk radio, often don't even follow the same standards of verification that stations like Color 10 must do as part of our commitment to you, our viewers. Color 10 is not in the business of pushing a political ideology or party viewpoint, and we cannot imagine a time when our news would be dictated by a corporate or political theme. Brian, the good news in all of this we're talking about here is that we the people have the power to push our elected officials to make changes that'll reform our system in ways that can support a more perfect union. Thanks for watching.